Hey, welcome to yet another edition of the Frank Figluzzi Show. And I know today you're not tuning in for me. You're tuning in for Barbara McQuade, and I don't blame you. So, look, Barb and I go back quite a while. Gosh, I don't know, maybe 2010 or something. I've got to give that maybe earlier. I got to give that some thought. But in case you don't know, let me do a real brief introduction before we bring Barb on for what I know will be a great discussion. She was, of course, the U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of Michigan for about 7 years. She stepped down as part of Donald Trump's dismissal of U.S. attorneys in 2017. She's professor of law at University of Michigan Law School. In her spare time, she's a best-selling author, including her first book, Attack from Within, and now The Fix, Saving America from the Corruption of a Mob-Style Government. We'll be talking a lot about that. And, she's a legal analyst for NBC and MS Now. And you all probably know that she's a co-host of the podcast Sisters in Law. Let's bring on Barb McQuade. Barb, thanks for joining.
Hi, Frank. Well, thanks for having me. And I will say, I believe it was 2010 that you and I first met.
Yeah.
You were working as the special agent in charge of the FBI in Cleveland.
Yeah.
And I was the U.S. Attorney in Detroit. And because of a conflict, I was brought in to help work on a major public corruption case that you were investigating.
Big corruption case. Boy, that ended up with over 70 convictions of public officials in northern Ohio. And yeah, for people wondering, what do you mean a conflict brought Barb in from Michigan to Cleveland? And those were the days, I'm going to be sarcastic.
When those things mattered.
Those were the days when conflict of interest mattered. And U.S. attorneys, like the great one in Cleveland, said, hey, I probably shouldn't work this one.
Yeah.
We cared about that back then.
I mean, think about that. So Steve Dettelbach, who was an incredible U.S. attorney, went on to become the head of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives during the Biden administration, said, I represented one client who was, I'm not sure he ever got charged, who was like a witness in the case. Yeah. And he disclosed, I represented this guy. I think he might be in some ways implicated in this case. I think I need to step back. And it was the kind of case that, every prosecutor yearns to be part of. And so he sacrificed his role in the case for the good of the case and for the good of legal ethics. And so as a neighboring district, that's common. We would handle each other's conflicts from time to time. I was brought in to handle the case, but man, how quaint, Frank, that
how quaint that people cared about ethics, and also how quaint that the DOJ worked corruption cases. Even
yes, they cared about public corruption. Imagine that.
Yeah, that case resulted in the longest federal sentence for corruption sentence for a sitting public official in. I think ever.
Yeah, it was Jimmy DeMora, and I remember it. He was involved in some very significant public works contracts, fraud, bribery, extortion, and then that 28-year sentence was the sentence adopted by the judge in a case in my district involving former Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick, because judges start looking for comparables, and said that the conduct in the Kilpatrick case was as bad, if not more egregious than the conduct in the DeMora case, and that he deserved a similar sentence. So those were important sentences. Of course, I don't know about DeMora, but Kwame Kilpatrick's sentence was later commuted by President Trump.
Yeah. DeMora's out now. I think he had some health issues, but happy to help. Happy to help establish a sentencing precedent, perhaps.
Yes. Well done. When corruption still mattered. That should be your next book, Frank.
My first book was The FBI Way. I may now say the FBI lost its way for my next book, but we'll see. Let's hit a couple of news items that are on everybody's minds, and before we get into a deeper discussion of The Fix, your new book. And I know you're about to launch quite the national book tour, and I want to make sure people who are listening can figure out where you're going to be, and so coming soon to a city near you. But let's first hit an article. Was it New York Times that you were quoted in yesterday about the grand juries? Do I have that right? Do you even know that you were quoted?
I don't know. I don't recall. I don't know that I saw it, but tell me more.
So yeah, hey, you were so happy to let you know, Barb, that there's a lengthy quote from you in, I think that's the New York Times yesterday.
Yeah,
and it is the sad state of affairs where, and I even talked about this on my show yesterday, where we're finding grand juries can no longer trust anything a prosecutor says in front of them. And where judges ask for transcripts of grand jury proceedings like never before. We're seeing judges outraged at what goes on inside the grand jury room, and we're seeing more misconduct allegations against assistant U.S. attorneys than we've seen before. And I wanted to get your thoughts, since you're quoted at length.
Yeah, no, I now recall. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on, we sadly, you and I have been talking for years since the first Trump administration about how we're seeing the erosion of our institutions. And we hope to God the day doesn't come when the justice system is just so broken that even grand juries won't indict anybody. Where are we?
Yeah, and I think that's a huge risk. I was confused because this question came up in the context of the Broadview 6 case, the case out of Chicago, where the charges were dismissed against the defendants because of a finding by the judge of attorney misconduct before the grand jury.
That's right.
Finding things like talking to grand jurors in the hallway outside of the grand jury room, like that's just not done. Vouching for witnesses, sort of like, oh, you should believe this guy, which is also inappropriate. And there was a third example in that case. But what was most troubling to the judge was that when she asked them to turn over a transcript, they redacted the bad stuff.
They did. Said, so there's like an intent to deceive.
As officers of the court, like you've got to be forthcoming on this stuff. And now that I see what it was you were concealing, that's worse than any of them altogether. But the challenge with this, Frank, and the reason it's so troubling is, first of all, the idea that DOJ lawyers are engaging in misconduct, it's not unheard of. It's happened from time to time, but you get training on this. It's all being transcribed and can get turned over. That alone serves as a check on any potential abuse. But why would you even want to? A big part of presenting a case before a grand jury is getting the candid feedback of the grand jurors, because this is a case I'm going to have to take to trial eventually. So if it has problems, like tell me, I want to know, and maybe I will go investigate more evidence and bring it back to you. So it's really important from an adversarial perspective to get that candid feedback. But one thing, to answer your question, I worry about is the judges are saying that the Justice Department is losing what is called the presumption of regularity. That is something DOJ lawyers have enjoyed for generations. And it means when you go into court and you say, Barbara McQuade on behalf of the United States, that means something. It means that justice is my client, that I am not just trying to win, I am trying to see that justice is served. And as a result, I get the benefit of the doubt from courts. They aren't looking at the colloquy between the prosecutor and the grand jury because they presume that everything was kosher, that I didn't do anything that was improper. But more and more with the Jim Comey case, the Lindsay Halligan case, this one, we are starting to see judges say, you've lost it. You've lost this presumption of regularity. We've had too many instances of prosecutors disobeying court orders or being misleading that we're going to make it, you show it to us. And so as you raise, the risk there is that down the road, when a prosecutor of good faith comes into the grand jury room and presents evidence and asks the grand jury to return an indictment, we may lose that ability because grand jurors don't trust the system. Or it may be the case that judges are going to demand to see that colloquy with the grand jury in every case. And sometimes, you say, what's the big deal? It can be a big deal because sometimes you are investigating multiple cases at once. You might charge a piece of the case that is ready. Maybe you're charging it in hopes that somebody might flip. That is, agree to a guilty plea in exchange for testifying against the others. If you have to turn over all of that, it will make it difficult to have that kind of investigation within a larger investigation, as we did in that public corruption case that we talked about in Cleveland. 70 people were ultimately convicted, but not all in one indictment. There was a whole series of indictments.
Yeah, really good. I have to wonder if some of this intense interest in just getting the indictment, because as you said correctly, you want, as a prosecutor, you want to get a glimpse of, hey, how are the citizens going to react to this when I ultimately present this at trial? But it seems to me they're skipping that part and saying, look, this is conjecture on my part, but my boss wants the indictment. I got to show even the White House that we indicted this person. See, and then, let the chips fall where they may later on, as they are repeatedly in the District of Columbia, where the cases aren't moving. They're not moving. They're being rejected.
Yeah. Well, you say it's speculation, Frank, but it's an educated speculation, because remember when Ed Martin first got his job as the head of the weaponization task force? I think he's gone now, but this was the guy who was the interim U.S. attorney for a little while in D.C. He's represented some of the January 6th defendants. He's an election denier. One of the things he said at that time is, even if we don't have evidence sufficient to convict people, we're still going to name and shame them, because this is a society that respects shame. That's not how it's done in the Justice Department. There is a concept known as name and shame. It's typically used for defendants where you have the goods, you have the evidence, but because of perhaps an extradition issue, maybe they're in China, they're in Cuba, it's going to be difficult to ever bring them to court to answer to these charges. I think Robert Mueller, when he indicted the Internet Research Agency, considered that a name and shame, but he had the goods. And now instead, what we're seeing is U.S. targets who are being named and shamed, even if perhaps they don't believe they have the evidence to convict these people. Perhaps a willingness just to get that indictment, because probable cause is a much lower standard than the guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. You need to convict at trial. But an ethical prosecutor, under DOJ's principles of federal prosecution, it says you should not indict, even though all you need is probable cause, a defendant, unless you believe it is probable that the evidence is sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction at trial. That means don't even start down this road if you don't think you can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And
the irony
you do if that's not what's going on.
Yeah, the irony in Ed Martin's ideology is that it's the ultimate weaponization of government. It's going after people just to go after them. And you're right. In my days as the head of counterintelligence at the FBI, we did the name and shame thing came up in the context of Chinese hackers for the Chinese PLA. And the fact that we would just announce publicly, we are indicted, we're never going to lay hands on you, but we've got the goods on you, and essentially neutralize them, hopefully in some way, shape, or form. But let's go to a second news item, and that's what I'm calling the slush fund for felons, and I'd like to call it some harsher things, and we're legally. We're all outraged at this and the idea that, gosh, we could be writing big fat checks with taxpayer dollars to people who not only assaulted police officers and vandalized the Capitol, but tried to stop a peaceful transition of power, and then some of them even reoffended. Some who were convicted, some who pled guilty. But where do we stand legally on the hopes of challenging this?
Yeah, I think there is some hope. First, can I tell you a fun aside that I just learned?
I need fun.
The word slush fund. Where does that come from? Do you know? I just read this. Slush in the old days of shipping was the extra like fat and grease left over after they cooked the meals, and slush was just fat, was of value to candle makers and others who needed this grease. And so they would go into the sailors would go into a port and sell off all this fat, all this grease, the slush. And then they would take the money and use it for their own stuff off the books, like booze, books, magazines, whatever it is they wanted to buy. But they used it.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you don't just get legal analysis on the Frank Figluzzi show. You get history. History is being discussed here. That's right.
It makes sense, right? So it's the stuff, it's off the books. Nobody's going to account for this. I can just use this money the way I want to. But, where does it stand legally? So first, I am absolutely convinced that if this case had stayed in court, it would have been dismissed by the judge. Donald Trump, certainly he did suffer.
You're talking about the IRS lawsuit, Trump suing his own IRS.
Yeah.
For a contractor releasing his tax.
Yes. Yeah. So, and that contractor, by the way, was charged criminally. It is not for nothing. Tax returns are supposed to be kept secret. Maybe he's got a claim for some money damages, but certainly not $10 billion worth worth. I mean, that's just laughable.
No.
His net worth has gone up exponentially since he's been in the White House. So can he trace any harm to it? I don't know. But, so he's got that. But you raised the point about suing his own Internal Revenue Service and his own Treasury Department, of which it is a part. The judge herself in this case had said, hey, I'm going to need briefs explaining how it is a court has jurisdiction over this as a genuine case or controversy, which is a requirement before a court may exercise jurisdiction. And 2 days before those briefs were due, Trump voluntarily dismisses the case. They knew where this was headed. It was going to get dismissed.
Yeah. He was going to lose.
She had also appointed amici court experts to weigh in, a former judge, some former DOJ officials, who said, not only does it appear that there is no adversity between the parties here. I mean, if you buy Trump's unitary executive theory, he is the executive branch, so he is suing himself. They said, it's very strange that DOJ has not raised some of the defenses it routinely raises in every case. First, the statute of limitations. This event occurred in 2019. The lawsuit was filed in 2016. I'm not great at math, Frank, but I think 26 minus 19 is more than 2. It's a 2-year statute of limitations.
Oh, wow.
And they didn't raise that, which is routine, right? This case should be dismissed because it was filed too late. The other, they did not raise at all the doctrine of sovereign immunity. The government enjoys immunity from being sued in civil cases with some very rare exceptions. Not asserted in this case. And then the third thing they pointed out was the one we mentioned initially, which is they did not argue that Trump failed to trace his $10 billion in his claim to any measurable, quantifiable losses. So all of those reasons say this case was doomed from the start. Nonetheless, they enter into this contract to resolve the case. Here are some other problems with the resolution. The Justice Department does sometimes resolve with plaintiffs who are out of court, either before they filed a suit or after they've been dismissed. Usually once a suit is filed, they stay in the court and the judge will oversee the settlement. But it seems, perhaps my suspicion is maybe that's exactly what they wanted to avoid here. So we'll dismiss the case and then we'll just have this out of court settlement. But the other problem is, according to DOJ's own policies, is if you're going to settle a case, you can even have benefits to third parties, although it is frowned upon. And Pam Bondi had issued a memo saying she was prohibiting third-party beneficiaries to lawsuits. It should trace to the same claim that the lawsuit was based on. Trump filed a lawsuit for violations of the Privacy Act and the Internal Revenue Act. Now the settlement fund is for weaponization, whatever that is. Todd Blanche was asked what that is in front of Congress last week, and he said, whatever, we're open, any kind of weaponization is eligible. That's not a thing. Like, there's no statute that makes it a crime or a civil infraction to weaponize the law. So
when you use the word in defining the word, you're not defining the word.
Exactly. Weaponizing. And then the other thing that's really egregious, I think, is this cherry on top that gets filed the next day. Maybe they were hoping that they would sneak it past the media, who is focused on the outrage of the first day with the slush fund. And by the way, the IRS will stop its audits of Donald Trump for any claim that's ever been brought or could have been brought up to today forever. Again, not traceable to the Privacy Act claim or the the Internal Revenue claim for the release of his tax returns. This is something else entirely altogether different that has been, hounding Trump for decades. It's all off. Never mind. Forget about it. We're not going to worry about that anymore. So he gets these benefits that are completely divorced from his alleged grievance of this leak. So what about the challenge to it? We have seen some private individuals file challenges to this, like couple of police officers who were injured that day, who say that this will invite more retaliation against them, more threats against them, which they've already suffered. As sympathetic as I am to their cause, and I'm very sympathetic to their cause, I think they're unlikely to have legal standing to bring the suit. That's because you have to show that you have a direct and articulable harm based on the what has happened here. I think their harm here is going to be far too speculative in this case. You know who I do think have standing to sue would be members of Congress. Now, it would have to be Congress as a body, and with the Republican Party controlling Congress, including both houses, I don't think they have standing, or I don't think they're likely to assert that standing right.
And Congress, because you're asserting that Congress has the power of the purse, they're supposed to come up with budget expenditure, and they've not been consulted on using taxpayer dollars in this manner.
Yes, I think that they would have standing to say, you have stepped on our power of the purse. We create this thing called the judgment fund, and we rely on you to exercise your duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, to dole out these funds in good faith, to resolve legal claims in the best interest of the United States. This convoluted two-headed monster, a lie built on a lie, built on a lie, is no such thing. And so we are suing for, under the Administrative Procedure Act, under ultra vires for your lack of power to do this. But I think that in light of the fact that the Republicans currently control both houses, it's unlikely. I mean, Trump has been really aggressive in asserting his power lately in running primary challengers against people who have crossed him. But all the more reason, I think, for voters to oust some of these Republicans from Congress, because if you can get a Democratic-controlled Congress, it would have 2 to 3 years of a statute of limitations to bring one of these lawsuits. And in fact, a Congress controlled by Democrats could do something even more efficient, which is to enact legislation by a margin that is veto-proof to rescind these funds, to say you cannot use funds in this way. We have the power of the purse. We have this judgment fund. We are excluding from the judgment fund your slush fund because we find it to be unlawful. So I think the answer lies in voters electing people to Congress, and they have the opportunity to do that this November and replace some of these Trump-controlled MAGA Republicans with common sense. Even if you've got a common sense Republican Congress, either house, I think, would be sufficient to have standing to bring this suit. I think if you get both houses with a veto-proof majority, you could also enact legislation.
Well, there is some hope. I mean, they've got the week off because they went home. And part of the reason the Senate and the House went home was because they couldn't take this. This couldn't pass the smell test, this slush fund, and we're seeing cracks in the armor in the GOP, in the Senate and in the House. So there's hope. But you are saying, just to clarify, that it would have to be the entire Congress signing off on this lawsuit against.
And the majority rule. So you could have either house, but I think you would need the majority in favor of saying, yes, we are going to vote in favor of bringing this lawsuit.
What about you and me as taxpayers bringing an action? No,
it's a great question, but it's been tried and failed that taxpayers don't have standing to express disapproval with the way our taxpayer dollars are spent. Seems like we are suffering a real injury, right? I mean, we entrust these people to spend our dollars lawfully, and if it's not lawful, it seems like we should have standing. But that one has been pretty definitively resolved. The taxpayers don't generally have standing to attack misuse of funds.
So while I did not intend this question to be a great segue to The Fix, your next book, you have just given us an example of how to fix a tangible problem. So I love what you did with the title, which is The Fix. Two simple words that really have two different meanings, at least. One is very literal, how are we going to fix this mess? But the other refers back to mob talk. And, the fix is in. Tell me, why did you call it The Fix? Am I guessing correctly that this is supposed to have two meanings? And,
absolutely.
Even more generally, what brought you to write a second book?
Yeah, well, it was early in Trump's second term when he began doing these executive orders against law firms, universities, and the media. I mean, three really important institutions in society. And what I saw, Frank, I know this will resonate with you, are the same kind of tactics that you see with corrupt public officials or organized crime bosses. And that is, I'm going to use my power to inflict pain on you. And by inflicting that pain on you, I'm going to coerce you to come to the table to negotiate your own punishment. And if I can do that, I can get people off stage. I can silence my critics. I can control them. And of course, people always think, well, I'll just pay once and this extortionist will go away. But in fact, the opposite is true. Once you identify yourself as an easy mark, they keep coming back for more because they know that they can control you. You can't complain about it because to complain would be to admit your own complicity, and others are watching. And so they say, well, if that big, powerful law firm or university had to bend to the leader's power, I don't have a chance. And so it reminded me of some of those cases. And I thought, I want to share with the public what I've learned in prosecuting these cases. And that is, bending is never the answer. It only makes the criminal, the corrupt public official, the mob boss more powerful.
Absolutely.
What works is collective action, when you come together and call out that behavior and band together. And so what I wanted to do was name and identify the tactics I see the Trump administration engaging in. I mean, same thing with tariffs with foreign allies.
Yes.
And then offer some solutions, again, based on the work that we've done about strategies that work to fix this problem. We are not helpless to fix this problem. We have power as individuals. We have power collectively in industry, in university communities, and through our elected officials to say this is not right. This is not how we govern in America. And,
Right.
I don't care who comes next, if it's a Republican or a Democrat, but what I care about is restoring good government, a government that reflects the will of the people.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of people might be saying, look, I think, haven't we had books before that pointed out how horrible this is and woe is me, and this is how we got here. And they're good books. But this book, folks, in my language, is a bit of a to-do list. It actually says, here's how we got here. Here's how this is mob behavior. But here is how this gets fixed. And some of it has to do with, yes, getting the right people in office as we move forward, but some of it actually can be done now and in the near future. But talk about examples. I mean, we're about to, in just several weeks, this country is going to celebrate its 250th anniversary. And, many of us are keeping a list of things the founders likely never anticipated in terms of a level of corruption.
Yeah.
You talk about a presumption of regularity. I think the founders actually said, we're probably going to have a president that follows the rules. Do you have, what are 2 or 3 things, if you could sit down on the 250th anniversary of the nation and with some of the founders, what would you be asking them specifically about the Constitution to say, what did you really mean here? What would be on your list?
Yeah. Well, one would be the unitary executive theory. I'm very skeptical of this theory, right? This is the one where, Todd Blanche will reach into his coat pocket and pull out his pocket constitution to try to look so learned. And he'll read you the vesting clause that says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. And like that, end of story. Of course, you also have to read all the other parts of the Constitution to understand it, including the one that says, the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So that means I don't get to just call the shots, right? I have to comply with all of the other laws that Congress has enacted. So I would ask them, so you've just declared your independence from a monarchy. You fought a war that lasted 7 years to separate the United States in the name of liberty. Did you really mean to have a president that has the powers of a king? Because I'm guessing the answer to that is no. But I would like to hear a little more about the unitary executive theory.
Yeah, cool.
That's one. Yeah, that's one. I think I would. Well, go ahead.
No, well, I was going to say, what about birthright citizenship?
Oh, yeah. Well, that comes along, of course, in the 14th Amendment. And I think that's one that you would have to ask the Reconstruction Congress that enacted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments at the end of the Civil War. And I think I would ask them, so when you say all persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof shall be citizens of the United States. Did you really mean all? Or did you only mean, those who had documented? Because if we got these people who claim to be textualists, and they say, the words have to be in the text, and if they're not in the text, they don't count. So how come you left those words out if you meant to exclude people who are not documented immigrants? I think that would be an interesting one. The third one I would ask, Frank, and this goes back to the original founders, is about the emoluments clauses. So you put these emoluments clauses in. You said one is the president should not get any emoluments from any state in the United States or the United States except for his salary, right? And you also said he shouldn't take any foreign emoluments from anybody. Emoluments, I think, means gift from any foreign person, nation, national. Did you mean that even though you had these in there, that if somebody did it, there should not be any penalty and that it is just okay? We should just, nod along with it? Because we have a president who thinks that's just a suggestion. It's just advisory because he's taken he took a plane from Saudi Arabia. It's worth $400 million. Do you think that's an emolument, a foreign emolument that might make a president beholden to a foreign government and might cause us to question his loyalty? How about his sons and businesses developing all kinds of lucrative projects overseas? You think that would be a foreign emolument? So I think
your heads would explode, unfortunately. I would want to throw in, how many times did you mean to say that a president can run for office? How many times?
Oh, yeah, there's a good one.
Yeah.
There's a good one. Yeah.
What did you mean there? Because we're going to face that. We're going to face that.
Yeah. Well, that one's a little bit tricky. That comes along in the FDR era.
It does.
And it says a president may not be elected more than twice. Elected. That doesn't mean you can't serve.
I know. We're going to see Steve Bannon has claimed he's working on it. He's working on that. There's wiggle room in there, and we'll see. Let's talk about something near and dear to my heart, which lots of things are in your book, but Americans tend to think we're the kind of the center of the universe, and it's human nature, and we do live in a great country, but we fail to learn lessons from not only from history but from other places. And we're not the first country to go through stuff like this.
Yep.
And I had a recent guest, Ruth Ben-Ghiat.
Oh yeah, she's great. I quote her extensively in my book.
Well, yeah, and rightly so. And she talks about Italy, and she's lived in Italy, and she's a scholar on Italian fascism. What can we learn from other countries that have been through this?
Yeah. So, Italy's a great example with the fascism of Mussolini. I think certainly Germany with the Third Reich, and more recently Hungary with Viktor Orban. And I think that, when there have been times of great upheaval, people look for some stability and safety and security. And I think that is what some of these regimes are selling, that will keep you safe, it's a time often of influx of people, of technology, and it's certainly something that we're living through right now. Our world is a little bit disrupted by all of the changes in it, immigration, technology, and other kinds of things. But what we've seen in all of those regimes is that there's been a repression of freedom. And that I think, if anything, our own Declaration of Independence talks about the state, the natural state of man is one of liberty, right? We want life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so these things that maybe it's a bad trade to say what I really want is safety, security, and the status quo. And I will, say what you need me to say. I'll bend to the oaths. I'll do whatever it is you need, as long as I can have that safety, security, and preservation of the status quo. But of course, what we see in all of these regimes is a loss of freedoms, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, academic freedom. And so as a result, these societies all tend to go downhill. We see scientists leave, medical research go over to other countries. And as we lose those checks on power, the leader amasses more and more power ultimately so that he can stay in power. They also surround themselves with sycophants. They don't want a competent person who pushes back and says, wouldn't it be better if we did X or Y? What they want are yes men. And what you see when you have yes men are what we're seeing right now in Putin's Russia, right? He thought he could go into Ukraine and have an attack that would last about a week and win the war. Here we are 3 years later. And may I venture what appears to me to be happening in Iran, where Trump thinks we're going to go in, it's going to be quick, we're going to take over, we're going to have regime change, and everything's going to be great. Well, he's got people like Pete Hegseth advising him. Is it any surprise that we are not successful when we don't have the best and brightest, most competent, willing to go against the grain and tell the president hard truths? So ultimately, most of these systems fail on their own. But in the meantime, a lot of people get hurt, a lot of repression, people are jailed, and I don't want to go through that before we end this regime. So I think those are some lessons we can learn from other countries in history. And I think that the sooner we get out of this path, this downward spiral, the better.
Yeah, Russia, just recently, there's been a fascinating survey. And, you think, wait a minute, they're polling people inside Russia. How do you do that? But yeah, people are not honest when they're polled. And that's what's shocking about this survey is even knowing that the government's listening, there's an incredible, significant percentage of Russians who are telling pollsters, yeah, this war is no good. We're not happy with Putin. And the pollsters say you could probably double that to get an honest answer. Yeah. So, all right. But so these systems collapse. That's good news. It's good. Give us some tangible examples from history, American history or world history, where the people did things that helped to hasten the demise of authoritarianism.
Yeah. I think I'm not sure I would call it authoritarianism, but a really interesting parallel to our own time, I think, is the Gilded Age, a time when the robber barons were getting very wealthy off of the backs of ordinary people. And some of the work that got done there was really just exposing to ordinary people this grave injustice and this incredible inequality. And so journalists, they called them the muckrakers, went around and photographed people living in tenements. And then they would photograph people going into the, high society Vanderbilt Mall and our mansion on Fifth Avenue. We had a lot of books at the time about, terrible conditions in meatpacking plants, food and drug contamination, all of these things, the corruption and bribery that was going on in the railroad industry to help lift up certain companies over others. And I think exposure of those things in great part through journalists and authors. Theodore Roosevelt was someone who observed all of these things firsthand and became a progressive Republican who cared about things like child labor laws, which were passed to help kids out of these unsavory conditions in factories, passing of the first Food and Drug Acts to protect our food from contamination when they're in these horrid meatpacking plants. We saw the passage of conservation laws and the establishment and expansion of our national parks, because Theodore Roosevelt said nature should be enjoyed by everybody, regardless of your station in life. We shouldn't let this be developed by just the Vanderbilts, and the Rockefellers. We should let's set aside a lot of land for everybody to preserve. So I think that's one really interesting moment. I think another is the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And one of the things that really helped, I think, was the advent of television, when people could see the atrocities being done to these peaceful protesters in the South. You've got Black men and women and children dressed in their Sunday finest trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, or walk the children's march down in Birmingham, Alabama, where they get sprayed by fire hoses and attacked with police dogs. I think people of good faith, saw this, and it really opened their eyes to say, oh my gosh, I didn't know I hear, complaints about voting rights, but I had no idea there was this kind of hatred. And that, I think, brings people the independents, the people who tend not to get involved, the middle of the roaders. I think those people, when you can capture their attention and their hearts, that's when things can change. And then the last one I'll mention, Frank, I'm a big fan, I quote him a bunch of times in the book, of Justice Robert H. Jackson Jr. He was a Supreme Court justice. He was also an attorney general at one time. And he also, this is so extraordinary, while he was a justice on the Supreme Court, takes a leave of absence to go over and be the Nuremberg prosecutor after World War II. Imagine that day, right?
Yes.
Like Elena Kagan says, hey
Yes.
guys, I'm going to be gone for about a year. I'm going to go prosecute this big case. But he did. And I think one of the lessons of that is it was important to show the world what had happened in Nazi Germany, atrocities that perhaps were not more widely known, showing the evidence. Here it was, this really happened. I think that helps avoid all the Holocaust deniers. President Eisenhower went through and had somebody film the camps and, the deplorable conditions that people were living in these concentration camps, because he said someday people are going to deny this happened, and we need to make sure that it's documented and memorialized for history. And so he did that, convicted these war criminals and held them accountable to justice. I think after this administration is over, there's going to be this urge to let's just move on, in the manner of, Gerald Ford, thank goodness our long national nightmare is over. I'm going to pardon Richard Nixon. I think there's going to be a temptation to do that. And I hope we resist that temptation, because I think without accountability, we may see this happen again. Why did we see Nixonian politics happen again? Perhaps it's because Richard Nixon was never held accountable for what he did.
For sure. So no, I'm with you.
Arise again.
I'm with you on that. And I know my viewers are getting sick of hearing me say this, but you got to watch Nuremberg on Netflix. It's free now. You don't have to pay if you've got Netflix. And the story of Justice Jackson and Nuremberg trials is there. And it's not only great acting, but it's a great essential story for our times. And as you're going through these examples, people might be saying, okay, that sounds great for history. What about us? Well, you're giving us real life examples. So for example, your emphasis on journalists and reporting, and you can see now why it's so important for the Trump administration to control the media, because the examples you just gave of exposing the wrongs, and the emperor has no clothes, and the robber barons. Well, we're going through that now with the broligarchs, as they're called, the CEOs in Silicon Valley, and corporate media. We're very close to now CNN and CBS being controlled by the same folks who are in Trump's corner. And that's why I'm such a big fan of independent journalism. And people say, well, what can we do? You can support independent journalism. You can support the Sisters-in-Law podcast. You could support Barb's book. You could support my account. But we've got to get people telling the story. And some of the younger folks who are out there right now really exposing things, from Epstein to data centers, are going to be the ones who let us know what's really going on.
Yeah, and I think it's as you say, all the more important now, because some of the corporate giants really are beholden to the Trump administration. I think that there are billions of dollars in profits available for mergers of these media giants, and the decision makers are seeing the dollar signs and are willing to compromise in exchange for that big payday, because they know that the Trump administration controls the decisions as to whether these mergers go through. It's a really sad state of affairs, but that's all right. If they're not going to do their jobs, there are plenty of people willing to do that. And so I am also a big fan of journalists and independent media. There's some really great outlets out there that are nonprofit, right? Like Texas Tribune is nonprofit.
Yeah, Texas Tribune's great.
Yeah, there's still PBS and NPR. A lot of defunding has occurred there. But what's been great for both of those organizations is private donors have stepped up to keep the funds going. So, but we do need to support them to get the kind of independent journalism we need, so that we have information, right? I mean, just to go back to our founders, I don't know if it's Thomas Jefferson or James Madison, one of the great founders, who said, democracy depends on an informed electorate. And
Yeah.
so we need information if we're going to make good decisions about what's happening in our country, and exposing some of this corruption and wrongdoing is an essential part of that.
As we start to wrap up, what's one thing or maybe two things you would tell the viewers that they can do to start taking back our democracy right now?
Yeah, I think it's having conversations. I think one of the things, people don't trust one another on social media or opposing viewpoints, but we do trust our neighbors and our friends and people we know. And so talking with your friends and neighbors about politics, even when it's uncomfortable,
Yes.
I think can be really important. I think the other thing is, even if it's somebody with whom you disagree, one of the things is, in real life, people are nice and normal and relatable. And so even if you have a neighbor who might not share your political outlook, having conversations with them and sharing what you share might cause them to reconsider their view. So I think that's one thing, just talking to each other. Another, Frank, is engaging in peaceful protest. And I've been so encouraged to see how many people have been in peaceful protests, some of these No Kings protests, and they might even have a sign, "This is my first protest." Because protest actually works. And I know sometimes people say, "Oh, you're just preaching to the choir. You're not really going to change anything." And that's just not true. I cite some statistics in the book done by a political scientist named Erica Chenoweth, who says that in the hundreds of regimes she has studied, she has found political protest works if only 3.5% of the population participates. And that's what makes it so important, because not only do you have the protesters out there, getting the attention of the public, but it is energizing for the people who participate, right? Even the choir needs to hear a good sermon every now and then. And so it emboldens each other, but it also causes people who might be sitting on the fence who say, this slush fund does sound kind of corrupt. And then they see their friends and people they know and thousands of people protesting in the street. It might open their minds to what's going on. So I would say participate in a peaceful protest. Bring a funny sign. It's all great that you're just out there. So those are two things.
I totally agree. Two great things. I know personally, I've been shocked at the turnout in even small rural towns for No Kings days, and I know people are driving by noticing. You can't ignore those numbers, and it's causing them to think. And then on the personal conversation stuff, I know a lot of folks have an attitude of, look, I got nothing in common with these MAGA folks. I'm not talking to them. But I'll give you just a short example. There was a MAGA guy that I was talking to, and I just happened to mention how outraged I was. I had gone to breakfast at a local cafe, 2 eggs, bacon, hash browns, coffee, $25. And I said, this is getting ridiculous. And he says to me, I know he's a Trumpster. He said, it's outrageous, and I don't see how Trump gets us out of this. And it was a conversation about the cost of breakfast that caused him to articulate that he's turning on Trump. I recommend trying it. All right, so you're going to launch the big book tour. The book is The Fix for folks who want to pick it up now. I don't expect you to necessarily have memorized your entire city itinerary. But it's more cities than the World Cup. So where are some of the places you're going where people can see you?
Well, next week I'll be in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington, D.C. Later in the month, Chicago, Atlanta, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles, and San Diego. I may be forgetting some other great cities, but it's not for lack of love in my heart. It's just the weakness of my brain.
That's awesome.
I'm really excited to get around and engage with informed people who just want to be part of the solution.
I'm glad you're doing it, and I recommend folks try to make an effort to go not only get the book, but to go see Barb if you can. Barb, thanks for taking the time out. I know you're busy. Thanks for all you do. Keep up the good work.
Thank you for having me, Frank. Good to be with you.
Take care. Stay well. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining the Frank Figluzzi Show and Barb McQuade. And we're going to continue to have great guests like Barb and many others. Take to heart some of the things we've talked about today. Get the book and get to the tangible examples of things that we all can do. There's hope and encouragement in the book, and we all need that now. Thanks for joining. Stay well. I'll see you next time.